I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 169er of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. And someone else in this episode, we are honored to have the return of Dr. Bob Rodrigues of Duquesne University there in Pittsburg, Pennsylvania, sitting right there on the banks of the Monongahela River in that great city. Dr. Rodrigues is a renowned educator. He has been teaching over 50 years. Currently, he's teaching an excellent course about the Vietnam War and the Vietnam era there at Duquesne University. He has graciously agreed to come on this podcast to tell us a little bit more about that war. In the previous two episodes where he was on the podcast, that is 1691 and 1692, first he talked about the history of Vietnam going all the way back to 40 A.D., when the Truman sisters led a rebellion against the Chinese Han Dynasty. Worked pretty good for 4 years until the Chinese came down and retook the place and cut their heads off. That's where Bob Rodrigues started telling us about Vietnamese history. It's so important to know that, especially if you're a Vietnam veteran. Remember back when you're over in Vietnam and you're sitting in a bunker and the rockets are flying in and blowing up and you're thinking, why are these people shooting rockets at us? We didn't do anything to them. Bob Rodrigues is going to tell us why they were shooting those rockets. In episode 1692, he talked about why we turned our back on Ho Chi Minh back in 1946, when Ho Chi Minh cited our Declaration of Independence when he declared Vietnam to be a free country. Unfortunately, that didn't last long. In this episode, Dr. Rodrigues is going to talk more about the history of Vietnam going back to World War II and how things that happened in Europe affected the situation in Southeast Asia. Dr. Rodrigues does an excellent job in explaining this, and I think it is a privilege for you to hear what he has to say about it. It is very enlightening, and it gives you a whole new perspective on the Vietnam War. In this episode, he's going to be talking about historical context. What happened back there that caused our leaders to make the decisions that they did? Today, you can look back and say they made some pretty boneheaded decisions. When you understand the context of the things that were happening back in those days, in the 40s and the 50s and the early 60s, it makes it a lot easier to understand. And you begin to say, maybe those guys knew what they were doing, or they did their best for the country. Right now, I'd like you to sit back and relax as Dr. Rodrigues tells us more about the history of Vietnam. Matter of fact, don't relax too much. I would advise you to have a pencil and paper out because he's going to give some very interesting information with dates and names that would be helpful to remember. There will be no exams given after he finishes his programs, but for your own benefit, it would be a good idea to retain some of the information he's going to put out. Get ready. Here comes Dr. Bob Rodrigues of Duquesne University to tell us more about the history of Vietnam in the early days.
Hi, Mac. If you remember, we finished up last podcast when we took it all the way up to Ho Chi Minh in 1946, but we had gone back all the way 2,000 years to the Truman sisters and tried to show how Vietnam history was a story of being subjugated by foreigners and therefore the will of the Vietnamese to throw off the yoke of their oppressors. And this had, deep roots, 2,000 years. And finally, on September 2nd of 1946, Ho Chi Minh delivers that infamous speech in which he claims that Vietnam is now independent. Now, to pick up from there, I really need to go back. I want to stress something that I think when you study history, you have to look at context. If you just look at the event, you are missing the story. In other words, what was going around that was impacting the events that were occurring? What was the thinking of the actors? By the actors, I mean the people who were making history. What was their thinking? What was they soaked in terms of which is going to affect their decision making? So we're going to start at Yalta in February of 1945, and this is still in the midst of World War II. And the big three, Franklin Roosevelt of the United States, Winston Churchill of Great Britain, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, met at Yalta. Yalta is on the Crimea. The Crimea is a peninsula that juts into the Black Sea. So this was really being hosted by the Soviets. Now, the purpose of this meeting was, it was evident by February of 45 that the Nazis were going to be defeated. So the idea of the meeting was to try to set up a post-war Europe. What was post-war Europe going to look like? Now, at Yalta, they came up with a number of provisions. They met for a week, is actually February 4th to the 11th. They indicated that Germany and Berlin would be demilitarized. There would be free elections conducted in Poland. The Soviet Union agreed to join the United Nations in San Francisco. But really, one of the most important provisions was that secretly Stalin agreed to enter the East Asian War if called upon by the United States. And by that I mean the war with Japan. Stalin was not involved in the war in Japan. This was basically a war by the United States because of Pearl Harbor. And we had allies out there in terms of the Free French and some of the British and so on. But for the most part, this was an American theater, of war. But what we feared was that the Japanese would come back into a kamikaze mode and therefore wreak, huge amounts of casualties upon American troops. So the idea was to recruit Stalin and to recruit him and possibly bringing the Japanese down. So that was a secret meeting. But see, at this point, this is what's safe to say. Some European nations were incapable of resisting communism. They were fatigued, exhausted after so many years of war. Asia was just as susceptible to communist expansion. Their governments and their military forces were weak, and their borders were not well policed. So this was a dangerous condition, because although Stalin was our ally in World War II, as soon as the war ended, then the alliance broke apart. And we'll go back to that big three in a minute. But in 1945 April, Franklin Roosevelt dies. Okay, and that is a key cog in the alliance. This is Roosevelt, who had been at the helm of the United States throughout the Great Depression and World War II. And he had poliomyelitis, as we all know, and by 45 he was exhausted. I mention that because at Yalta, Roosevelt was not at his sharpest. He was 2 months away from death. He trusted Stalin too much, despite the opposition of Churchill. Churchill warned him, but Roosevelt referred to Stalin as Uncle Joe. He says, don't worry, we'll handle Uncle Joe. Well, unfortunately, we didn't handle Uncle Joe. Let's go to now July of 1945. This is after Roosevelt had died. And there was a conference at Potsdam. Potsdam was a suburb of Berlin. It was chosen because it was one of the few areas of Europe that was not bombed out. So they met there. Now the big three had changed. From the United States, it was Harry Truman. And Truman had been elected vice president in November of 44. And quite honestly, he had not really gained the trust of Roosevelt yet. So he was not on the inside. And Roosevelt is going to die 6 months later. So Truman comes in very, I don't want to say naive. Truman was a sharp character, but he did have a little naivete, meaning he didn't really know how to deal with Stalin. From the British, it was a man by the name of Clement Attlee. Incredibly, Winston Churchill had been voted out of office in July of 1945. Story behind that. But what we have now, the big three, is Joseph Stalin, Harry Truman, and Clement Attlee. And Stalin ruled the day. He knew it. He had been successful. Germany had surrendered in May of 1945. He was at the zenith of his power. So Potsdam comes about, and here are the provisions. First of all, the United States and Britain were forced to recognize governments in Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary. And these were communist governments. And they're referred to as de facto. A de facto is Latin, which means the reality of it is that's the government in power. The opposite of de facto is what we call de jure, Jure, and that means by the law, legally. Well, these governments were not legal, but they were, in fact, in power, and they were communist controlled. In addition, the United States and Britain was forced to recognize government in Poland, which was also controlled by the Soviets. Now, where Vietnam comes in here is the provisions of the Potsdam Conference that Vietnam would be partitioned at the 17th parallel. So this is important because this was the notion now that Southeast Asia and Asia as a whole really were now being eyed by the major powers of the world. So if we were to look at a map of Europe in 1946, what you would see is all of Eastern Europe swallowed up by the Soviet Union. The traditional border of the Soviet Union for 1,000 years was the Eastern Baltic to the Black Sea. But now that border, because they controlled these countries such as Bulgaria, Poland, Romania, Hungary, and then later on Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and of course East Germany. Now their border was from Stettin on the Baltic to Trieste on the Adriatic. Now I use that phrase because that's the very phrase that Winston Churchill used when he declared the existence of the Iron Curtain. He said, quote, from Stettin on the Baltic to Trieste on the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across Eastern Europe. So what we were faced with there was a growing Soviet Union under the guise of communism. So let's go back. Let's rewind a little bit. Okay. In 1917, I'm going way back, Vladimir Ulyanov, who we better know as Lenin, called for an international revolution once the communists were successful in the Soviet Union. Communism was a movement based on class rather than nationality or race, so it would transcend borders, nationalities, patriotism, and language. He established something called the Comintern, which is short for Communist International. And the idea behind this was to support communism in other countries and to facilitate the spread of communism. It provided training material to support people like the Vietnam nationalist Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was one of the disciples. Now, in the 1930s, this desire by Lenin, now Lenin, of course, died in 1924, and he was succeeded by Joseph Stalin. But they were pretty much hemmed in from expansion because of the rise of Adolf Hitler. And Hitler had a virulent regime, and he seized territories like the Rhineland, which was an area between France and Germany that had always been a tug of war because there was a mixture of French and Germans living in the area, and it was a very rich, fertile area. Hitler seized Austria. He seized the Sudetenland, which was Western Czechoslovakia. Then he seized all of Czechoslovakia. This was all brought about because of what we refer to as appeasement. Okay, let him take it, then he won't take any more. And then, of course, he did. Well, let him have this one, and then he won't take any more. Well, the buck stopped at Czechoslovakia. Now, if you were to move into the Asian area, you would see the same thing with Japan. They basically expanded all over the Pacific and into Asia unchecked. Okay, understand that two things. Europe was pretty much exhausted from World War I, particularly the French and the British. That had been just a beast of a war. The United States was still ploying the idea of isolationism. We didn't really want to become involved in world wars. We did in World War I just to kind of save the Western world from Germany. But now we were still professing isolationism. And this goes back to George Washington, believe it or not. Now, let's bring China in here. Okay, they now had become communist as well with the succession of Mao Zedong in 1948. And the Western world, the British, the French, the United States, believed that China was a vanguard for the expansion of communism in Asia. And Korea was the first example. And now Ho Chi Minh was gathering support. Now, all that is the context for why domino theory emerged. This is where the domino theory gained credence. You know, today it is very easy to blast the domino theory, because the domino theory essentially in Vietnam was that if Vietnam falls, then Laos will fall, Cambodia will fall, Thailand, Burma, India, Malaysia, Australia, the Philippines will all go down like dominoes, and they'll become under the communist regime. And we know that didn't happen. So it's easy to scoff at it and say that the domino theory was a failure. And if you look at it simply on paper, yes, but it's very easy to be a Monday morning quarterback, particularly in history. History is filled with some extremely powerful lessons, but they're not always easy to absorb and use because they're subtle, they're ambivalent, they're ambiguous sometimes. It takes very sharp, acute leaders to be able to interpret them and use them wisely to make decisions. But here's the domino theory. Basically, it was the belief that the communists would spread from one nation to its neighbors. It did in Eastern Europe. The theory drew on the ideology of Lenin, who called for an international revolution. See, and the actions. It was very insidious. We're gonna overthrow you. It has nothing to do with patriotism or England versus France. Communists, all are communists. So therefore, I don't define myself as a French communist or an English or German or Russian. We are of a different sect, and the sect is the belief in communism. This was pretty scary, pretty scary. Now, the first use of the domino theory analogy was made by President Dwight Eisenhower. I'm going to play for you 4 comments made by American presidents. Okay, the first is going to be Dwight Eisenhower. The second will be John F. Kennedy. The third will be Lyndon Johnson. And the fourth will be Richard Nixon. By the way, those were the 4 presidents who presided over the Vietnam War. Gerald Ford came at the very, very end, and you wouldn't include Truman or Roosevelt. But listen to these comments.
So when the United States votes $400 million to help that war, we're not voting for a giveaway program. We're voting for the cheapest way that we can prevent the occurrence of something that would be of the most terrible significance to the United States of America, our security.
If we withdrew from Vietnam, the communists would control Vietnam. Pretty soon, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Malaya would go.
If this little nation goes down the drain and can't maintain her independence, ask yourself what's going to happen to all the other little nations.
If the United States now were to throw in the towel and come home, and the communists took over South Vietnam, then all over Southeast Asia, all over the Pacific, in the Mideast, in Europe, in the world, the United States would suffer a blow. And peace, because we are the great peacekeeping nation in the world today because of our power, would suffer a blow from which it might not recover.
Yeah, if you listen, obviously you hear a common theme in there. And essentially what they were all expressing was the belief in the domino theory. Asian nations were seen to be particularly susceptible to communism. As I said, their governments and militaries were weak, their borders were fluid, and their population was basically uneducated. So the domino theory became accepted as a reality by U.S. presidents. It was the underpinning of the United States foreign policy.
Thank you, Bob, for that excellent recounting of Vietnam history. I know as a Vietnam veteran, it's very enlightening for me, and it helps me understand even more what was going on over there in the Vietnam War and why it occurred. I can't wait for the next episode where you're going to tell us about the French returning to Vietnam and what happened at Bien Dien Phu. I encourage everybody to not miss that podcast episode that will be coming to you in the next episode tomorrow. If the creek don't rise too high, it'll definitely be there. I appreciate you coming to listen to these programs. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more on this podcast, The Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?